Welcome back. We're almost done with this section here. Just this one last thing I'm going to show you, and that's how to create scripting calls for your animation controller. So let's just see what's happening in this scene first. So I've done a couple things here. I've attached the camera to this guy just so we can see him move around. I created a little bit of code to lean him forward here. And of course we had that animation trigger, so when I hit that spacebar, boom, he should jump. We'll do a little spin. And let's see if I can't slow that down a little bit. There we go. Yeah, slow it down so we can actually see it. So, really simple animation controller. There's a lot more complex ones I can create. And you can see all those states firing left and right as certain things happen. There we go. And a lot of times we have several things that need to happen at once. We would put them on different layers, but we're just kind of doing it in a simple form first so you can get an idea of how to manipulate these and trigger certain things using the Mechanim controller. There we go. Alright, so let me show you how I did that. Here is the script. Now, of course, we're going to do this for the labs. You'll have step-by-step instructions, but let me go down my script, okay? So, first thing I did here, loaded up that Annie.getComponentAnimator. Alright, so I created a variable here called public animator Annie. And what that does is it allows us to load up an animator, kind of like we did with the audio. We can load up this animator component and give it that value Annie. So Annie is our variable, and that will become a value of whatever animator is attached to the object that this script is also attached to. So let me just scroll down here and see, okay, for this one, now this is how I'm controlling the body. The body movement's happening with the horizontal and vertical axis. You can see it's incredibly simple. I'm not doing anything too fancy here. I'm just moving them left and right and forward and back along his space self means his local z-axis. Alright, now here's where we start setting triggers and our booleans and all those other kinds of cool things with the Mechanim control set through scripting. So I say if my input get key down. This is pretty important. If you're doing it as a trigger, you want to have a get key down or get button down. You want to have it down because a trigger only happens once. So if you hold that key down, that trigger will keep happening because it's going to keep reading your key. So oftentimes if you're using a trigger and you put input key instead of input key down, and undo that, what you'll do is what just happened to me is I was going through it and the animation started happening twice in a row. And I couldn't quite figure out why until I realized that key down and trigger are about the same thing, so about the same length of call. Okay, so when I say input get key down, and I'm just going to use a straight up talk to the hardware, the space key, we could do it as a get input. It's not really important in this instance. Alright, so I'm going to say Annie set trigger, right? So that sets the trigger. So any trigger that I have there will be accessible to me. So I can set the trigger value. And I'm just going to say spin trigger. And I don't have to give it a value that when I say set trigger, it means set this trigger on and then it will immediately go off. So it just means trigger this event. All right, and spin trigger is also the name, you can see where my cursor is, of the parameter that I created to fire the spin animation. And remember, we set that up in the transition. So we already exposed those variables that are controlling part of our Mechanim. Now we're just calling them up in code. And set trigger will be a subset of Annie, which will be controlling this animation controller. Alright, so now the next thing I did here, and this is, once again, really simple. We could get really, really complex with this stuff, but we want to keep it as simple as possible right now, just so we get the gist of it. So what I've done is said, if input get axis vertical is greater than 0. So that means basically, am I moving forward in the vertical axis? And that could be the up arrow, which I am using, or the W key, which some people like to use. So I've got this up arrow happening on my keyboard, this vertical axis, and I'm going to say Annie set bool. Now that's going to be this boolean lean forward. And why do I have it as a boolean and not a trigger? Because I want it to keep happening. I can use it as a trigger and say trigger this animation, and then trigger an animation back. It's not so important for this animation. I could do it either way. I'm just doing it with a boolean because I'm playing around with a couple different things and saying, okay, if the vertical value is true, or greater than 0, I should say, then I'm going to set that boolean lean forward to be true. That means that it play the lean forward animation. Now that animation is not loop looping. It's not a looped animation, which means it'll play once and stay at the end. So now I can say if the vertical value is equal to 0 or it is not moving forward, then I'm going to say set boolean lean forward is false. Now why do I say that? Because now I have another transition here that says, okay, if the value of lean forward is false, then I want it to transition from the lean forward to lean back. And the lean back is simply the lean forward animation sped up and reversed. So it's kind of a cheat here, so I can use the same animation twice. So I'm leaning from center to forward here when my lean forward variable is true, and I'm going from lean forward back to the center, which is simply reversing the lean forward animation if the value of lean forward is false, and that value will be false if I push the back button or I let it fall to 0. So you can see right now, you can see my idle is playing, right? Here's my floats going on. Now I hit the forward arrow, and you can see I'm stuck on that lean forward animation. As long as that forward arrow is on, right, the Boolean is on. But now when I let go of it, you can see what happens is that the forward lean reverses itself. I let go, boom. Reverses itself, and it plays the animation a little faster so I can give it some variation. Now there are lots of different ways we can do this. I could actually even put his rotation on the axis value and not even use an animation at all, which is what would be a little bit more efficient. But for the sake of showing you how this code works, it's a little bit more fun to put this in the animation state machine and watch it go. So I go forward and just let go, and boom, snaps right back. And you can see as soon as that snap back animation is done, he goes right back to his idle animation. Now, if I wanted the idle animation to play on top of the lean animation, how would I do that? Well, if you notice that I have kind of a mutually exclusive setup here. I have this idle that's going on, and when I change some parameter, like I move forward in space, what's going to happen? Well, this lean forward is going to go on, and it's going to override the animation that's already playing, right? Because it says play a new animation. I can't play two animations at once, but actually I can. What I would do is create another layer, so I can play multiple animations on different layers, and they'll add to each other. So it's kind of a nice way to be able to say I want him to float up and down, even if he's going forward. I can't do that if I put it all in the same layer. I can't do that if I add layers. We're not going to do layers. It's a little bit more complex, a little bit beyond the scope of this introduction to game programming with Unity. But if we do go on to an intermediate one, we'll definitely get into layering animations so that we can have multiple animations happen at once. So just to recap here, what I did was I created this public animator type of variable with the name of Annie for the variable, and then I assigned it in start, so when the game starts, it's going to load up the animator for whatever this is attached to, and then I put in some code just to move my guy around based on my vertical and horizontal controls. And then I have this input get key down space that says if the space key is hit, he will do his spin animation. It will create or set off that trigger. So we say Annie set trigger, spin trigger. And we can say if input.getAxisVertical is greater than 0, means if the arrow key, the up arrow key is pressed, this lean forward will be true. And if I cease to press it, right, or if I press the back button, or anything else happens, or this value turns to 0, then it will make that Boolean false, and the animation transition from the lean forward to the snap back to center will occur. So it's pretty simple when we start setting up these networks. As we start layering and creating what are called blend trees and things, it gets more and more complex. But this is a basic way to set up and trigger animations in your scene using Unity's new Mechanim system. When we get back, we'll work out a lab that allows you to do exactly this, maybe a little bit simpler. I'm just going to have you trigger that spin with a single animation scripting call.